Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. Why so simple?
I am Iron Man. This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Well, welcome to this podcast review for September 10th, 2024, and I'm Jaden Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Thanks for joining us, everybody, for this conversation as we delve into the world of Jeremy Saulnier. And for longtime listeners of the show, you may be aware that this is a little bit of an anniversary of sorts for Brendan and I.
Jeremy's our best friend. He set us up. He set us up on a date.
Brendan's very first appearance on the In Session Film Podcast was on an old extra film episode discussing Blue Ruin, his debut film back in 2014. That was the first time Brendan and I had a conversation together here on the good old microphone. And here we
back
are
in
now.
the offices of Lexington, Kentucky.
Yeah, and that was 10 years ago. So in
was.
a sense, this is like, 10 years in the making. Coming
And
back.
Jeremy, 4 years later, bringing us back together once again. 4 films later. Because, this Blue Ruin, Green Room, Hold the Dark, and now this one, Rebel Ridge.
Exactly. And I believe we've done reviews for all 4 of them. So,
yeah, I don't think I was on board for Hold the Dark. I think you had someone else on for that
I had a guest
one.
on for that episode.
Yeah. That one I had to miss for whatever reason. But we certainly talked about Green Room together. And obviously, as you mentioned, Blue Ruin being our first date. It was our first date. So
our first date.
so Jeremy's our In Session Film Cupid in some ways.
Exactly. And I do love him for that. It's wild that it's been 6 years since he's done a film. I know he directed a few episodes of True Detective, but this is his first film since Hold the Dark in 2018. That's wild. That's hard for me to believe. But here we are. He is back, and he's back in a significant way. People are talking about this movie. It is available right now on Netflix.
Yeah.
If you want to go and check it out, if you want to watch it, then come back. But very excited to delve into his latest. Before we get into it, Brendan, were you aware of this movie earlier at the beginning of the year, maybe when we did our most anticipated of the year? Or is this a surprise for you like it was for me? Because I was not aware of this film.
I think I knew that Jeremy Saulnier had something up his sleeve that could have been slated for 2024, but as far as what it would be, who would be in it, let alone even the title of it at the time, that was sort of a surprise for me, especially given how it was released and even marketed to us, because it almost feels like it was, I don't want to say dumped on Netflix, because apparently it's doing pretty well on Netflix. I think it's sitting in their top 10 most streamed films right now, at least given new content especially. But it does feel like there wasn't much buildup or hype around it, which is maybe where the surprise came from. And I do think that's unfortunate, because I think Jeremy Saulnier is a really interesting filmmaker that we need to pay more attention to. I do wonder if the reputation around Hold the Dark may have hurt him a little bit, because I know that one wasn't as well received as Blue Ruin and Green Room. And maybe that was part of it or something, but I think this is one that I could see getting some talk, Rebel Ridge in particular. I think this one would get people talking.
Oh yeah, this one already has people talking. It has stirred the hornet's nest in a way that I do think is quite fascinating. We'll certainly get into it. Part of the issue as well. So Hold the Dark comes out in 2018, and it's a film that I do like. It might be the lesser of those first 3, but I still think it's quite good. Part of the issue as well, and this is the part that I didn't know of. In 2019, John Boyega came on board to star in this film.
Right.
So that was just a year later.
Yeah.
And one presumes that they were going to start shooting sometime after that. Now, for whatever reason, it did take a couple more years to get together. And it then became delayed because of the pandemic, as everything was.
Sure.
Of course.
It's another victim of that. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. So principal photography does not begin until May of 2021. As they begin, and it's interesting that people aren't talking about this, but maybe it's because this isn't well known. I don't know. But John Boyega pulls a Joaquin Phoenix. He simply leaves the movie and does not tell anyone. He simply did not show up on set after the day after they started.
That's just wrong. That's harsh.
It wasn't until he left, or they checked the hotel, he was gone. Now, I don't know the reasons. I believe Netflix has stated there were family issues. I don't really know. And fortunately, the big difference between Boyega and Phoenix here is that they were still able to complete this film. Now, it did delay things, obviously, but we may never see that Todd Haynes film, unfortunately. And people are completely out of a job.
Yeah, because that was written and made around
for him,
Joaquin Phoenix.
Joaquin Phoenix. Yeah.
As we'll talk about with Rebel Ridge, I mean, who we have leading this movie. I like John Boyega quite a bit, but
we'll talk about it. We'll talk about it. It worked out well in the end. They were still able to make this. It wasn't made for John Boyega, so that is certainly the difference there. And again, I don't know any of the details, so I don't want to presume anything, but on the face, it does seem a little iffy.
Yeah.
At any rate, Boyega abandoned the project for whatever reason. He is replaced. They finally get production going up again in April of 2022. It is wrapped on July 24th of 2022. And post-production and perhaps other factors, it doesn't come out until, of course, September of 2024, a few years later. So quite the journey for this movie. Quite the journey.
Took some time. Apparently it takes a while to make a movie sometimes. Who would have thought?
Does. It does. And according to Netflix, so it released on September 6th, this last Friday, of course, as we are recording this.
Right.
And according to Netflix, the film has amassed 31.2 million views in its first 3 days. I'd say that's pretty good. Pretty good.
I wonder why that is. Because, like we mentioned earlier, there wasn't a lot of marketing for this movie, unless I may have missed it.
I think it was word of mouth. No, you are right. There was one trailer that dropped about a month ago or so. That was I do remember Boyega and Jeremy Saulnier coming together. That was some news. Again, that first dropped in 2019. Of course, you hear news like that all the time. Back of mind, out of mind, you completely forget about it. And this is a film that wasn't on my radar at all until the trailer came out. Now, when the trailer came out, people got excited because it was actually a really well-cut trailer.
Sure.
Was very good. Now, we'll kind of get into it. I think it sells a different movie than what's actually here.
It sells more of a green room than it does Rebel Ridge.
A little bit of that, yeah. So it does sell a little bit of a different movie, but it was an enticing trailer, and that did somewhat go viral at the time. So I think there was that. But other than that, you're right. There wasn't much marketing aside from that because, again, it's Netflix. They don't really do anything except maybe release a trailer.
You know what it is, too? There are a lot of straight-to-streaming thrillers, crime thrillers especially, that get released these days. Not just on Netflix, but on a variety of streaming platforms that just go straight to those platforms. And they have garnered a bit of an audience. So Rebel Ridge would clearly cater to that already existing demographic. The difference here is that it's a really good version of that in a lot of ways. So then, in a way, there's a bit of a cross-pollination happening here between viewers. So you already have that viewership that might be attracted to the idea of this type of movie. And then you have people like us who know the people involved and want to see really good content. And then those who go and watch this movie on Netflix realize, wait, this is actually really good. I should tell my friends about it. So there is something about this movie that if it's doing well on Netflix, I think it's because it's catering to so many different demographics all at once. Like there is something weirdly universal about how people are receiving it, which is kind of cool for a movie like this, I think.
Yeah.
And maybe
Yeah.
that's what's ultimately working in its favor.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's been so much word of mouth that, especially once it came out, has certainly caught fire. And then some of these production things that I've been talking about, and the reason I bring it up is because it's also become a talking point. So,
Sure.
I think it will continue to snowball and become a big part of the story because, as we've alluded to, there is a big reason why this film could be remembered as it relates to one of its members. So with that, let's just go ahead and jump into it because I think we all know where we're going here. So Rebel
I
Ridge
think we played our cards a little bit. Yeah, I think we like this movie.
is written and directed by Jeremy Saulnier. It does not star John Boyega. Instead, in his place is Aaron Pierre. And
Mid-size sedan, baby.
Since we've already played our cards a little bit, I will say there is a high likelihood that Aaron Pierre will show up at the In Session Film Awards in one way or another.
Yeah.
And I look forward to that. But at any rate, Aaron Pierre is the star of this film, as well as Don Johnson, Anna Sophia Robb, Emery Cohen, David Denman, and a few others that come and go throughout. If you are not familiar with Rebel Ridge, it is about an ex-Marine who grapples his way through a web of small-town corruption when an attempt to post bail for his cousin escalates into a violent standoff with the local police chief. All right, let's get into it. Brendan, what do you think? Rebel Ridge.
Good movie. I think we already played those cards pretty vocally without actually saying those words, good movie. In fact, we might even be able to say great movie. You mentioned Jeremy Saulnier's previous film, Hold the Dark, which came out in 2018. That certainly seemed like Jeremy Saulnier's attempt to, and I don't know if this is his intent with that movie, but it seemed like his attempt to tackle something with a bit more sophistication after the meanness and the nastiness of something like Green Room, for instance. That definitely seemed like a film that he was trying to test his growth as a filmmaker. I think Rebel Ridge is another example of that, but it's the successful version of that progression. This feels like the next logical point for a filmmaker like him to relish in some of those tendencies to make something very thrilling and mean and nasty, but this one has a lot more sophistication when compared to his previous films. And I think that's ultimately for the best given the subject matter here. I wouldn't say it's tackling anything new that we may not have seen in other movies that deal with police corruption or small town corruption, especially in the South. The idea of racial profiling is a huge talking point here as well. We'll certainly talk about that. It's not reinventing any wheels. In fact, it's not even really that subtle about some of these things. But there's something about the way Jeremy Saulnier handles the material that I would say it's pretty delicately handled, which I did appreciate. And that's really the big difference here that makes the movie very thrilling. And just as a thriller, it's really, really compelling. As a 2-hour film, a plus 2-hour film, I think it's 2 hours and 11 minutes if you count end credits as well. It doesn't follow the traditional 3-act formula. It actually has a pretty unpredictable style to it. And I think that's what I enjoyed the most out of the film, is just watching it as a thriller. I really had no idea where it was going to go. Really at any point. New things start to come up and new developments happen. And I was always a bit of a step behind the film, which I found really exciting. And that was really cool to see in a movie like this that has a pre-established blueprint that we've seen before. I just think it handles it really well, on top of also having, as we alluded to, a great lead performance. I mean, there's a lot of drama around John Boyega and him leaving. But in actuality, if we found out that he was just replaced by a better actor, I would not be surprised if that were the case. Because I do think Aaron Pierre is that good here. I think he is really terrific. It's hard to do the kind of stoicism that he's doing in a compelling way that just looks like it's bottling up this kind of anger that's about to explode at any minute. He performs Terry like a time bomb, and there's so much tension around every ounce of his performance that I really did like. So I think this is a really good movie and a very rewatchable movie. I can't wait to revisit this one. So I think in that regard, it's probably one of the better movies of the year for sure.
Rebel Ridge absolutely rules. This movie is great. It is unequivocally my kind of movie, and that
Okay.
it takes its time. It's very methodical. The action is great, but the film is very assiduous in when and how it uses that action. If you're looking for a shoot 'em up, straight up revenge thriller, you're not going to find that here. That is simply not the kind of movies that Jeremy Saulnier is interested in. His movies tend to be more assured and subversive in a way that I absolutely love. And this film is no different. There is a tensity to it that is indicative of Blue Ruin and Green Room. There's a battle of good versus evil. There are political nuances all over the place. But underneath the veneer of its pulsating drama are these subtle yet powerful moments of heart and character. And that to me is what defines Saulnier the most. His films absolutely grip you. They are riveting and often intense, but I equally think about the performances he gets from his actors and how he utilizes subtlety to inform what's really going on. And as a result, what we get here is a star-making performance from Aaron Pierre. Talk about being in command at every moment. He is utterly captivating from beginning to end. He's often stoic. It's a very internalized performance, but when the film needs him to be, he's a very physically empowering presence on screen as well. While on the other end of that coin is Anna Sophia Robb, who gives a measured, delicate performance and
she's
equally
great here.
compelling.
And that could have been a
also very
character
good.
that could have been like, in a way, that's the hardest character to pull off in a movie like this, because you might sit there and think, oh, that, like, we don't need this character that she's playing, but her performance is so good that there's a necessary pairing between the two of them that you just want to see carry this movie in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. I love their dynamic. They are the beating heart of this movie, and they're completely magnetic together. It is really great to see how it unfolds. Blue Ruin, Green Room, and Hold the Dark are great films about violence with protagonists that are seemingly in over their heads. What's so fascinating about Rebel Ridge is that it is the antithesis. This film, of course, has its violence, but its protagonist is ahead of the game at almost every step. There are few surprises. It's fascinating to see Saulnier. It's almost as if he's commenting on his own resume. He is subverting the Saulnier experience in many regards. And when you couple that with the performances he gets here from Rob and Pierre, what you get, I think, is truly one of the best films of the year. It is a gripping Saulnier movie in the sense that he knows how to film action. He's really great at tension and drama. That's all here. If you like Green Room and Blue Ruin for the drama and the tension of them, you're going to love Rebel Ridge for that alone. But in terms of how he tackles violence, this is him flipping the coin in a way we haven't seen before. And man, did I love that.
Yeah, especially when compared to his own filmography, like you're saying, but he's certainly maybe doing similar things with the classic revenge formula that we've seen other actors and other movies take on too. I mean, some people have already made the comparison to First Blood, that first Rambo film with Sylvester Stallone.
Sure.
And
Yeah,
the narrative blueprint of that film is pretty similar to Rebel Ridge. Maybe, from a sociopolitical standpoint, it's maybe dealing in different things, but the sense of police corruption against someone that might be culturally different from them, or at least based on their upbringing, I think does raise a lot of similar questions.
It's very much there for sure.
But Jeremy Saulnier is certainly taking that formula that we've seen run amok at times, especially when you have any insert Liam Neeson with a gun movie, right?
Exactly.
This movie is sort of a deconstruction of that formula without maybe trying to be a deconstruction of that. It's certainly flipping the coin, like you said, and giving a more delicate and measured example of that, which is why I do love that even though this movie is getting into very heavy sociopolitical ideas, it handles them in a very delicate way, even though it knows it's not trying to say anything new about those things. It's really just the way it's utilizing them for an idea of how violence can be so internalized. And I think that's what's so fascinating about the movie. And on top of that, yeah, Aaron Pierre's performance. Terry's a character that really has no backstory. And yet we find him to be so, like, we feel like there's a full backstory with him. He performs this character as if to suggest what is in his background outside of just his, his militarized training. What is it about him that makes him so compelled and invested in this plight that he finds himself in? And I love performances that sort of make you as an audience member infer about their backstories and what their histories are. And his performance very much does that, because you're right. It's a star-making performance. It's actually one of the best performances of the year. It is
Hands
that
down.
good. It really is.
It is that good. No, it is a star-making performance in every sense of the word. And I think, that's Jeremy Saulnier's films. I feel like every one of his lead performances and characters, they inform so much about the character through performance and the actions they take as we see them experience what they do without much exposition. We don't really get that in Jeremy Saulnier's films. And I do love how he continues that here. But as I noted in my opening thoughts, what I love about this film and how subversive it is to the Jeremy Saulnier film as it relates to violence and what we see in Blue Ruin, Green Room, Hold the Dark, and how violence is chaotic. They find themselves in these situations that are over their heads. Terry knows exactly what he's doing. He is perhaps 2-3 steps ahead of these cops in a lot of these moments. There are a couple of times he's caught off guard, but he's equally commanding, if not more so commanding than any other character here. So on one front, I love that about the film in terms of its subversive qualities.
Yeah.
I might push back against you slightly, or at the very least, I would argue that as it relates to the film's socio-political themes on corruption and racism, there are some new and interesting things here.
Okay. I'd be curious to hear what those are from your perspective.
Okay, so the film immediately demonstrates the racist tendencies of these police officers with how they treat Terry. And eventually we find out that they're exaggerating small misdemeanors, leaving individuals like Terry's cousin in a situation they shouldn't be, given that the misdemeanor is something minor. So it's not hard to see how systemic all of this is. But what I love about the film is that Saulnier doesn't linger on it or make melodrama out of it. Instead, what the film is really about is how their corruption has to evolve because of our current political and social climate. At one point, we learned that Chief Byrne was recently sued because of the police racist tendencies, and it nearly wiped out the force altogether. So now they're having to scheme up different ways to make that money back, which they do by stealing money where they can and claiming that it's for legal purposes, like we see with Terry in that opening scene, or by exaggerating these small misdemeanors and exploiting the legal system for profit. So what was once blatant racism on the surface has now triggered an underground war where a broken system allows corruption to reign in a very different kind of way. Funneling the film through that prism, I think, is very fascinating, especially when you couple it with Terry's background and how that murkies the waters even further. And maybe we can talk about that as well. But when we're talking about the social climate we're in now, everything is digitalized. And so vulnerable. I'll say everything we do is up for interpretation. Even police force. I live in Miami. We are experiencing that right now with Tyreek Hill over the weekend, and
Sure.
all of the video footage that has come out. That, ironically, I guess, or maybe not ironically, because this happens all the time, but it certainly plays into what we're talking about here in terms of how everything is so scrutinized, and
Yeah.
it should be. But because everything is so scrutinized, the police, at least in the context of this film, have to find a different way to funnel that exploitation. They have to find a different way to funnel their racism. It can't just be blatant like it used to be. And that, I think, does add a new and interesting element that makes this film all the more gripping.
I mean, in a high level way, what you're describing there is not so different than what we've been hearing for many years about Fortune 500 companies trying to utilize new ways of corruption to cover certain things up with regard to sexism and racism in their own thing. So, like that's where I think the movie might not be as new and inventive in those ideas, but I don't mean that as a criticism. I don't need this movie to have new and inventive ideas for it to work. In fact, what is very interesting and what you're getting at that I do actually agree with, it's the way the movie it describes the machinations of how the police force is creating new ways to funnel this corruption, as if to suggest here's a small town that used to operate in a certain way. They're finding new loopholes to keep their way of life the way it used to be. Like, I think that's at least a pretty interesting way of going about it. But I think taking it a high level way, it's not saying anything new in that regard. I think it's
Okay.
more or less saying, okay, we still know that this corruption exists. We still know that this type of behavior exists, and it doesn't go much beyond that. But again, I don't want to make it sound like I'm looking for something beyond that, because I don't think it needs to go beyond that. What I actually think is really great about the film is how I feel like it was taking some of those sociopolitical things and recognizing that even despite the lack of newness that I perceived, it still knows how timely and necessary that it is to tell stories like this because of how prevalent that it is.
Mm.
And I think that's actually what makes Terry's reaction so dramatically crucial for this movie working, is that even if it doesn't seem all that new and it's not reinventing those wheels, in a way, the fact that it's not is what's fueling that anger and that internalized violence even more. There's no real new thing that's doing that. It's that he's caught in something that we've been hearing about for so much time now, and that triggers something new out of him. So like I like the way it handles that. That's why I said it handles it really delicately, and I really appreciate the way that Saulnier is treating it in a way that even if it does seem recognizable,
Yeah.
I like the way a character responds to it in that regard.
Yeah, that's interesting that we see that maybe quite differently. I do think this film goes beyond any sort of conventional scope in that regard. Now, I do agree with you. The way that Terry responds to it, it is interesting how it doesn't really affect him, because he knows that this is a problem that exists everywhere, especially in the United States. So his reaction to it isn't really like, that isn't any different than any other film we've ever seen in terms of sociopolitical movies, especially as it relates to corruption and racism specifically. However, I do think the way this film taps into how the police, especially how they have to evolve because everything is so scrutinized, that I don't think we've seen much of, especially in movies like this. And the way
That's fair.
Saulnier taps into that, I do think adds, I don't want to say a newness, but it certainly gives the film a refreshing angle that I do appreciate without ever, again, this film doesn't linger on those things. It's not bogged down by it. It's not melodrama in any sense of the word. That is certainly not Jeremy Saulnier's style. But I do love how he allows those ideas to infiltrate these characters, how they respond. They have to adapt to these current conditions in terms of the social climate,
Right.
and they are having to adapt. So all of a sudden, those racist tendencies that used to be out in the open, and they still are here in Miami, apparently, but for a lot of others, and when you're sued and you're almost sued to oblivion, you have to funnel those behaviors in a different way, which of course we've certainly seen in the news all the time in the real world. So how this film funnels that here to add to the drama, I think is incredible. And
Okay.
I haven't even begun to talk about how Terry and his backstory adds to that conflict, which I think is great on its own terms as well. But I will absolutely champion that aspect of this film. I do think it's what makes it unique
Well,
among its brethren.
what does make it interesting in some way, and I think I may have mentioned this a little bit earlier in my thoughts as I was, responding to your interpretation there. I think this movie would not have worked nearly as well at all if it took place in a more urban landscape, in a more urban territory. The fact that this takes place in a small town, especially one in the South, I think does add a lot of perhaps interesting context around some of these themes, even if in a high level we may have seen some of them before, because it showcases how some of these small towns are trying to preserve the way that things used to be for them. The fact
Well,
that there is
that
a
and
lack
that's
of
it, right?
change.
Because Chief Byrne even mentioned at one point that the state was going to take over. So the only reason they
Mhm.
can exist is if they come up with the money themselves, which they have to do again by funneling
Yeah.
those problematic tendencies in a different way. They can't do it out in the open. They have to evolve. Going back to that. And maybe
Mhm.
you're right. Maybe in an urban setting, there's so much chaos going all the time that even when you're the Miami police and you're dealing with a high level NFL superstar, it doesn't matter that it's out in the open. I don't know.
Right.
Like maybe it's just different
Yeah.
when you're
Well,
talking about a cityscape, but
yeah, but a lot of times small towns have, and again, that's not to say every urban territory is the same, that they think the same way, because clearly you're referencing Miami, Florida as its own troubling example, right? But
uh,
usually in a lot of small towns, they maybe have a more, for lack of a better term, a more conservative way of thinking, right? And the fact that this example is certainly trying to preserve the way things maybe used to be, and they're funneling that through the operations and the machinations of the police force here, maybe that is the more intriguing development of some of these of some of these
yeah,
old themes that we've seen a lot of. But yeah, if you
yeah,
take this in a high level way, it's still saying a lot of the same things as, oh, there's corruption in the police force, oh, there's racial profiling, oh, it's fitting within the socio-political landscape. That's nothing new, but I do appreciate the new machinations and the loopholes that are being discovered. So in
yeah.
a way, it's
They
almost
have
like
to
I
funnel it
kind
differently
I ki
because
yeah, it's almost like me saying I like the plot mechanics of the movie
yeah,
and
yeah,
emphasizing that.
it's not that the behavior isn't new, it's how they funnel that behavior. That is a new concept in today's society,
Yeah, that's
given
fair.
how things
That's
have
fair.
shifted over the last
That's
10
fair.
years, when everything is publicized, everything is digitized, everything's on social media. Every interaction with the cops is,
Mhm.
someone is recording it. And that's what got Chief Byrne in trouble to begin with. Him and his police officers, we come to find out, because we know they're racist, they just by how they treat Terry in that opening
Well,
scene and throughout the film, uh, they got in trouble because of that.
yeah.
Well, okay, it
I
can't be out in the open now. We have to evolve. So yeah, the behavior isn't new, but how they enact that behavior has to change if they want to exist, because they keep
Yeah.
talking about the stakes are high. If they screw up again, the state is going to take over. They no longer exist as a police force. They will have
Mhm.
no more careers. So in
Yeah.
order to exist, they have to behave. They got to
Yeah.
stay out of trouble, but they can't do that because there's no money
Well,
by behaving legally. So they have to evolve and funnel that behavior, that corruption, in a different way
yeah.
that adapts to the current technological and social behavioral patterns,
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
it does make sense. I will say where this film, I guess, adds another layer of newness when compared to its counterparts, like let's say First Blood, for instance, which we referenced earlier, and there are a lot of similarities from a narrative standpoint between this film and that film. Where this film, I think, does a little bit more interesting things is that not every member of the police force here always thinks the same way. Like in First Blood, you have Brian Dennehy as, I guess, the police chief there. They all more or less function with the same mentality. In many ways, they were all kind of the same character, right? And here in Rebel Ridge, they kind of are perceived that way, but the film does conclude in a way that adds different arcs and different perspectives among them that I did find.
There's an interesting reversal. I do love that about it.
That was at least pretty intriguing.
Yeah, I agree.
In a way that resolves itself that could be seen as kind of anticlimactic if you're looking for a really big showdown of a finale here, which you kind of get, but you kind of don't.
Yeah.
Jeremy Saulnier is pretty good at that. You notice with all of his movies, they all end in interestingly anticlimactic ways. It almost sounds like a negative, but I actually think that makes his films kind of memorable because you find yourself thinking about, wait, what just happened? Why did these characters make these particular choices that didn't conclude in the type of way that I would have expected? It builds up to something that it doesn't always deliver on. And Rebel Ridge does something very similar that did get me thinking about how these perspectives among the villains here, the clear bad guys, start to shift in a way that was kind of intriguing.
I completely agree. To speak to that, I want to give some context to Terry because I do think that matters and certainly adds a fascinating complexity to those final moments because Terry, as we find out, and I guess we noted in the synopsis, right? He's ex-military. He's an ex-Marine. And there comes a moment, this is early on, it's not a huge spoiler, where Chief Byrne finds out that Terry never deployed. He was a Marine, but never deployed, which changes his view of him. And he begins to underestimate Terry. So the film subverts the meaning of experience and how value isn't necessarily derived from being in direct combat. Terry did not fight overseas, but that doesn't mean he isn't dangerous. He was a trainer for a reason, as that is ultimately why he never deployed. He was an instructor for the Marines as it relates to close combat, hand-to-hand, close quarters combat. And boy, does he demonstrate that in this film, especially as we get to the end and how things escalate. It is choreographed in such a specific way that utilizes his advantages as not just someone who was in the military and can face conflict like this, but how he strategically places himself in a position to fight these cops in close quarters. That I think is incredible. Like the editing and choreography there and the filmmaking from Jeremy Saulnier is absolutely riveting. It is engrossing in every single way. And I do love that while his Marine background, it is a big part of the character, I think it is woven into the film so organically. Like it never comes off contrived or jingoistic. And I think ultimately that's what makes the action really great, especially when it's grounded in a Jeremy Saulnier kind of way where
it's very visceral.
It's visceral and it's grounded in some sort of, well, I don't even say sort of, like there is a deep realism to it. So it doesn't come off climactic. There are these characters that are antagonists to the movie and you might be expecting some sort of payoff and you sort of get that, but not in a way that is conventional at all. And it will leave some viewers frustrated where you want that ultimate payoff where the film lingers on some sort of act of violence and the protagonist gets to have a say. That's just not here.
if you're looking for that kind of movie, you might find yourself saying by the end credits, wait, that's it? But
exactly.
For people like us, we want to look for why does Jeremy Saulnier choose to end this movie in this way? And for someone like myself, it gets me to think back on some of the little moments between characters in that final act, in that final fight, that conclude or linger in a certain way. One of my favorite examples being the Summer, played by Anna Sophia Robb, claims that she has an insider in the police force.
Yes.
And the revelation of who that is and how it's not the person that Terry thought it was actually adds a lot of very interesting nuance with relation to the film's existing sociopolitical backdrop. The fact that he thinks that this one character who would be the obvious informant here to be on his side actually is not.
Yes.
and because the movie chooses to end in a way that feels anticlimactic, it forces me to go back and think more on those other exchanges that certainly have more meaning. And I love that about it.
Exactly. And I love that revelation because, again, the subtlety of the reveal. So many movies, and I don't necessarily mind this depending on who the filmmaker is and what the story is, the execution of it. But a lot of films, when you get to this big reveal, there's some sort of dramatic, heightened fervor in the filmmaking, right? So either there's a lingering shot on eyes being wide open, or the score all of a sudden escalates, or there's some sort of major pause. And look, again, that can be fine. But what I love about this film is that it's a simple close up on Terry, and he simply utters, "Oh, that's who this is." That's it. And that's it. That's as far as the revelation goes. And then the action continues to unfold once he realizes the pieces of the puzzle were a little misarranged on his end. But once he puts that together, he acts and the film continues on its trajectory. And I do absolutely love that. And because there's a great irony to it, I also wanted to bring up the opening scene of this film and how it tethers to that reveal you're talking about, because again, there's a great irony. I love the opening scene of this film. It does a lot of heavy lifting. We see Terry on his bike. He's riding into town. He's knocked over by a cop car. They handcuff him. They're going through his bag. They see that he's got a pile of cash because, again, he's trying to bail out his cousin.
Yeah.
And through a bunch of cop jargon, they find a way to steal his money and claim that it's legal. And I love the cinematography there and the editing. It's shot with incredible precision. It immediately sets the tone that these cops are, of course, corrupt. They've probably pulled this trick God knows how many times, knowing that the victim will never see that money again. And in this case, it means Terry's cousin is likely to die because of certain dangers he's now going to face in jail.
Yeah,
so
for the reasons for being in jail. There's an interesting story around that, too.
Exactly. So in just a matter of minutes, the film outlines its good versus evil construct that isn't dissimilar from Green Room and Nazis and punk rockers.
Yeah.
And who these characters are in that equation. It is, I've seen this in a couple of reviews as well. Terry is like out of a classic Western where he rode in
his horse
in
the
wrong, at the wrong time, in the wrong town.
Yeah.
I've certainly seen that, and I very much do agree. But to circle back to what you were saying, one of those cops that we see at the beginning of the film, and I guess slight spoiler here, I'm not going to reveal who it is, but that it is that person. He's there. He's a big part of that opening scene.
Yeah, this could have been a huge problem with the movie. This could have been a big issue from a script writing standpoint, but I'm guessing where you're going with this, it's not. There are actually some really clever things here, both from a narrative standpoint and from a performance standpoint. This particular actor and what this actor is doing, I think, do show signs that reveal makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. And that's ultimately why I'm really curious to go back and revisit this film, because it's a little bit of that Amy Adams Arrival thing where the performer is having to give two performances simultaneously. And I'll admit, perhaps it sounds like you caught on to it. I did not on a first going. I was completely caught off guard by that reveal.
I will say I was caught off guard by the reveal because for a moment I thought it was going in the direction that even Terry expected.
Exactly. I assumed the same, which is I think of brilliance to the storytelling, right? Like
But
everyone thinks
yeah,
that.
but I will say in that opening scene that you're talking about, and how one of those police officers at the scene is this informant that we're talking about, I did
Yeah.
notice a few things with their performance that did get me to scratch my head a little bit, as if to suggest he this person's being kind of reasonable, but also not.
Yeah.
Like there is
Yeah.
this line that they seem to be trying to straddle, and I did pick up on some of those performative things, which
Yeah.
do make that reveal kind of purposeful. Then, like
Yeah.
it does make sense. So, like, I didn't know I wasn't like I was still tricked by the movie. But I did notice where those
Yeah.
clues are. I just didn't know they were clues for that particular reveal yet.
I will say, while I didn't pick up on how that character would become a major player at the end of the film,
Mhm.
what you're talking about there performatively and how it might subvert what you think in terms of an interaction between a cop and a
Mhm.
civilian, especially in that specific context.
Yeah.
Again, that's why I'll go back to our conversation we had a moment ago on the film's socio-political themes. That I
Okay.
very much did pick up on, because again, it can't be overt. That behavior has to be funneled in a quieter, more clever way. So instead
Mhm.
of the blatant racism, like we see in Miami, instead
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
that, this police force has already been scrutinized. One
Sure.
more false step, if they're sued again, they no longer exist. So they have to funnel their racism in a different way. They have to evolve.
Mhm.
So instead, what we get is that police officer that you're talking about there.
Yeah.
He's kind to him. He's more gentle than you would expect. He throws
Yeah.
a bunch of jargon at him that essentially amounts to, well, we have your money. It'll be at the police station. And if you want it, here are the processes. Here's some paperwork you have to
Yeah.
go through to get it.
Yeah.
And they give him all of these hurdles he has to jump through in order to get that money back. So the
Only to first
behavior
say
is
to
the
him,
same.
yeah. Yeah.
The behavior is the same, but they have to introduce it in a different way. So like that I did pick up on. And I
Well,
think
yeah.
maybe to your point, and I didn't think about it till now, is maybe the performance is tapping into both of those things simultaneously.
I think it was, yeah, because even though the quote unquote, I don't want to call it a sentencing, but the fact that they let Terry off with a warning only to then say, "Oh, but you're also not getting your money back. That's property of ours now." It's like,
Exactly.
yeah. So even
Yeah.
despite all of that, I did get the sense that this particular officer didn't like the fact that they had to do that. I was
Yeah.
getting a weird kind of duality there, which makes that reveal at the end make more sense. And maybe this is just major credit. And we're dancing around this because we don't want to reveal what this specific reveal is, but perhaps the credit has to go to this particular actor in trying to dance around
Perhaps.
all of
Yeah.
that. And I do think it's really delicately handled.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree, because I immediately caught up with the film's commentary there and
Hmm.
how that becomes such a big part of the movie. So I love the opening in terms of the tension of it, how it
Hmm.
establishes that these police officers have to handle their behavior as
Yeah.
corrupt and diabolical as it is. They got to do it in a different way. That I
Right.
caught up on, but I think as a result, I completely missed that perhaps there are cues that give layers to that character that just aren't revealed until later. But on a
Sure.
rewatch, you might be able to pick up on those cues, and I'm excited
It
to
it
to
might end
check
up
that
being one
out.
of the best performances of the year
It could
alongside
it could,
Aaron
could be
Pierre.
like surprisingly, because
Well,
it works at the end. Like I did not see
yeah,
that coming at all. Like
yeah.
it's a great, like it's hidden well enough, I think,
It is
within
hidden
everything
well
else
enough,
going on.
and even if you do notice what it's going for, or you notice something off about it, your first thought would not to it wouldn't be to go to what that potential reveal would be. It would be, to
Yes.
your point, looking for other things that support the film's thematic backbone.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so
Exactly.
that's like
Yeah.
it's doing three things simultaneously in a lot of
Yeah.
ways.
I agree. And
Yeah.
I think it's very, very effective in that regard.
Right.
Another moment I want to talk about here soon after that is when Terry goes to the police station to file the report that he's been robbed
Mhm.
by the cops, which I
Oh,
think
yeah,
is
what does he say? He
hilarious.
describes the first suspect and says, "And the second suspect just walked in."
Exactly, as he walks in the
Yeah,
background. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, it's fantastic, and he's doing this knowing that it's not going to work.
yeah.
But it's a great moment as Terry addresses his opponents up close and
Mhm,
personal. He wants to confront them face to face, which I think is a captivating way of narratively marrying Terry and his backstory, which is then revealed later on in this
mhm.
scene. And we get to see Chief Byrne somewhat recoil upon learning that he's perhaps underestimated Terry once he finds out that he is military.
Yeah,
And it ultimately leads to this incredible sparring between those two. And I absolutely love how that plays out. Again, because Terry is so commanding, he's not at
that's
all like the
yeah.
protagonist in Green Room and in Blue Ruin. Like he's going to, like, he knows what he's about to get himself
That's
into.
that
He
that's
knows.
kind of the Taken moment of the movie in
Yeah.
some ways, where like that in a way that's almost the equivalent of Liam Neeson, "I will find you and I will kill you."
Yeah. Yeah. And I just,
Yeah,
I love Pierre there because he brings this no nonsense intensity to the character and how his conviction has led him to taking on, this police force
yeah,
and wanting to do something about it.
yeah,
And this
and
is
how his
all before.
conviction started to influence others. Like, I think that's actually a
Yes.
really interesting thing too.
Absolutely. And all of that was before he even met Summer, the
Mhm,
Anna Sophia Robb character. And once they meet up, he learns so much more about the town and how that's affected all of these other individuals, including his cousin as well, that those two characters then become intertwined in a fascinating way
mhm.
that, continues to escalate in a very Jeremy Saulnier kind of way that I love, as we somewhat noted earlier.
Yeah. Uh, I don't know if this is my favorite Jeremy Saulnier film. I guess he's technically done 5 films. I've not seen Murder Party from 2007, admittedly. Um, so of those, I think Green Room is still my favorite, just given the music backdrop of that movie and how that speaks to me. And I just really appreciate the meanness of that one. That's a nasty movie.
Mhm.
But I think this is perhaps his best film. Like, in a way, this kind of reminds me the way I called it a transitional point for him. This kind of reminds me of, when David Fincher was making Seven, he would eventually then make Zodiac. This is like if Green Room was Seven, this is Zodiac. It's kind of like that maturation between the two in a way. And I
Mhm.
really appreciate the delicacy and the sophistication of this one. I cannot wait to see what Jeremy Saulnier has up his sleeve next. I really think he's one of the more interesting filmmakers working today.
I agree. I mean, I've loved every one of his films that I've seen, and I'm with you. I haven't seen Murder Party, but I've certainly
Yeah.
seen the other three.
I do like Hold the Dark as well. I didn't mention that
Yes.
earlier, but I'm
Yeah.
with you. I think if anything, that's a film that gets a little bogged down by plot a little bit more so than
Yeah.
some of his others. Like that, most of his films, Jeremy's films in particular, were were straddling that line between the 90-minute mark. And Hold the
Yeah.
Dark, I don't think quite justifies its 2-hour runtime. This one, Rebel Ridge, does because it's so unpredictable.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
it constantly goes in new directions, and just as a thriller, I had no idea where it was gonna go, and I found
Yeah.
that really exciting.
And maybe that comes down to him not handling the script for Hold the Dark. That was Macon Blair, who I also admire.
Yeah,
I do love me some Macon Blair, but maybe Saulnier is a little bit of a stronger writer. I mean, Hold the Dark is still a good movie. I still quite like it, but
yeah,
that is the only film of his that he did not write. So maybe
true,
that is, that has something to do with it. I don't know.
maybe.
But I do think as a writer director, he knows exactly what he wants to do. He streamlines his films wonderfully. And Rebel Ridge is perhaps the best example of it yet. I do think this is his best movie.
Okay. Okay.
My favorite still might be Blue Ruin. I
mean,
love that movie.
It's the In Session film favorite. I mean, that movie is the reason why we're here right now, 10 years later.
Absolutely. But I mean, I will say the more I sit on Rebel Ridge, that very much could change. I think it's his best and might be my favorite as well. It's just absolutely fantastic. I love seeing not just the way he handles these themes or even Terry's background as a Marine and how that becomes a big part of this film and all of the film's subtleties and realism. I think it all coalesces in this fascinating way. As we talked about, it might be a little anticlimactic, but it's really great. And it has a subtle heart to it that I think is really great as well. There's a moment in the film where Terry simply could have left, I guess, for the lack of a better term. Like, this film could have ended much earlier than it did, but because of his relationship with Summer and the stakes at play, how he's drawn back into it, I think the film earns that reversal. And
it makes sense.
It's just really great. And I just love some of that dynamic between those two characters. It's really great. And just some of the, again, I just have to emphasize the performance here by Aaron Pierre, and because he has this commanding physicalness to him that's really great. But I simply love some of the close-ups we get of him here when he's talking to other characters. He just doesn't seem like someone you'd want to mess with.
No,
and how that comes off is it's incredible.
A lot of that is also the cinematography. It's a very well shot film from David Gallego. And it's not just the emphasis on those close-ups that you're talking about, but even when it eventually turns into a bit of an action movie of a sort, there are sequences in the catacombs, I'll simply say, that almost utilize this one take in a way, and it almost feels like a level in a video game. And that almost might sound like a negative, because whenever you describe a movie as video game like, people might recoil at that. But in this case, it doesn't. It reminded me of myself playing the part of a first-person shooter and the unknowingness of something being around the corner. It actually is a very thrilling use of that tactic. And the film is just very well shot, is really the point I'm getting at.
I completely agree. No, I maybe that's one of the more underrated things about Saulnier's films as well, is the cinematography, and especially the editing. And he edits his films. Yeah, Saulnier does, and it's just absolutely fantastic. So,
good movie.
One of the best films, at the very least, of the summer, if we want to consider this the summer season still, or it's a great way to kick off the fall season. Maybe
it's one of the better movies of the year. It really,
it's great. Either way, it's wonderful.
And I don't always recommend movies when we're done talking about them, because I realize movies I might love are maybe more for me. So it's not about making recommendations, but Rebel Ridge is the kind of movie that I think a lot of people are going to enjoy. And like we talked about earlier, the fact that it's doing as well as it is on Netflix, the streaming numbers are pretty good. I think it does have this accessibility to it while still maintaining that artfulness that we love. So it's splitting the difference perfectly, and it's catering to both audiences there. So I think this is one we could universally recommend, and I think people will enjoy it.
I agree. I will say I don't know if I can quite go to that level, although I'm close to it. The only reason I pause is because, again, this film is quite subversive in a lot of ways. And again, if you're looking for a shoot 'em up revenge thriller, I guess I think of something like my dad. If I was to recommend this to my dad or maybe my brother, I could see them not liking this movie. Because again, it has those subtleties to it. It has that anticlimactic way of doing things that will leave some audiences maybe a little disappointed. But to your point, I think at the very least, most people will enjoy this film
I think it
to
still
one
has
degree
the
or another.
superficial thrill of a movie like this. That even if people don't latch on to the anticlimactic nature of, let's say, its finale, I think the journey getting there, a lot of people who go for these
Will
types of
really
movies in
like,
general,
yeah.
I think will still find it to be a thrilling experience.
I agree with, for sure. Yeah. But I could see some people maybe becoming a little undone by that final act.
Yeah, they were hoping for Liam Neeson to show up.
Depending on your viewpoint of the police, that could also play a factor. I can say fervently there is a contingent of people here in South Florida that will actively hate this movie. So like there's a certain segment of people that I interact with that I would never in a million years recommend this to, because of that specifically.
Okay, that's a fair point.
But generally, I agree. It's a movie that you could recommend, and I think most people will enjoy it. So,
yeah, it's a good movie.
With that said, if you're watching on YouTube, please leave a comment below if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us on social media. You can always email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com. Just a reminder, we have a review for Beetlejuice out right now as well. We got episode 601 where we talk about our fall. We discuss our fall preview.
Yeah.
We get into the movies of Tim Burton a little bit as well. It was a great time.
Yep. Good stuff.
There should be a new Women in Session out this week as well. And speaking of, they just celebrated their 100th episode last week. So if you missed that, go check that out. It was a lot of fun.
Amazing.
Hard to believe they've done 100 episodes already.
I know.
Wild. And of course, go check out episode 600, our Best of the Decade Awards. I'll plug that once again as well. Brendan,
a lot of work.
Any final thoughts before we get out of here?
Yeah, I'll plug episode 600 as well because we put a lot of work into it. Listen to it. I want people to listen to it, and hopefully they enjoy it.
Yeah, it was a ton of work, so I do hope people go and check it out. It was a great time. My final thought, Aaron Pierre is a star. I think we're going to start to see him in a ton of things moving forward, and I can't wait.
Yeah. I just hope his career doesn't take off because of Mufasa coming out later this year, and he just gets a bunch of Disney properties.
Yeah. It's very possible that could be the case.
Yeah. More Rebel Ridges, less Mufasas.
Yeah.
Although we haven't seen Mufasa yet, so it's not really fair to say.
I was going to say, I don't want to prejudge that. And he is voicing Mufasa. It's going to be hard to live up to the great James Earl Jones. We'll talk more about him on the main show this coming weekend.
Yeah, sadly.
So, I don't want to prejudge anything. He could be excellent. Like, if anything, all he's done is he's earned more than enough leeway with me.
For sure.
Because of
absolutely,
Rebel Ridge.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it's funny because on our fall preview show this last weekend, episode 601, we talked about Foe and how I skipped it because it got all these terrible reviews. And guess who's in that movie? Aaron Pierre. So I could have been introduced to last year, but I didn't. At any rate, with all of that said, thanks everyone for watching. Thanks for listening. We'll see you all next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Rebel Ridge is good. Go check it out.
Here, it's a star.